Welcome to a special Moving Panels one-shot. Today I'm handing the reins over to frequent guest host Tim Williams from the 80s Flick Flashback podcast. A few months ago, Tim decided to rewatch every movie in the MCU in chronological order. And so when he finished, I asked him to share his experience and what he thought about the movies with this rewatch now that we know the ending of the overall story. So enjoy this one-shot as Moving Panels brings to you Tim Williams' rewatch of the MCU.
Hello, Moving Panels listeners. I'm Tim Williams, and I want to thank Laramie for allowing me to do this quick little one-shot to discuss my rewatch of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I went back and watched all the movies from Iron Man, the original Iron Man, all the way to Spider-Man Far From Home, which is all of the Marvel movies that have been released up until this point. So I'll give you a little backstory. So back before Christmas of last year, since we had not had a new Marvel movie for several months and Black Widow had been delayed, we were waiting for WandaVision to release on Disney Plus. I said, you know what, over like the Christmas break or like during the holidays, I want to go back and watch the MCU, all the movies. And I remembered that there was a different order, I guess you'd say the chronological order, that we could watch. And I said, I think I want to watch it that way and go back and just rewatch all of the movies. But unfortunately, just with the holidays and family and stuff, I didn't get to watch them all very, right back to back. Several I did, but there were long pauses in between. And so a few weeks ago, I finally was able to finish. And so Laramie and I were talking, and he thought this would be a good little one shot to talk about the MCU and just rewatching the movies. Some of them I've seen many times. Some I've only seen a few times. So it was kind of neat to go back and watch them. But the first, talking about the chronological order. So I actually chose an order that the Russo brothers had actually released, or I guess they posted on Reddit or Instagram or Twitter or whatever, of the order that they recommended watching to get you to Endgame. And so I'll go over that real quickly so you know how I watched these movies. So it starts with Captain America, the First Avenger, which of course was not the first movie, but as far as like chronological, because it mainly takes place in the 30s and 40s, chronologically that's where that starts. Then from there, it goes to Captain Marvel, which of course the majority of that takes place in the 90s. Then you get to the very first Iron Man. So just starting with those three, it was interesting to go back and see the first Avenger, kind of chronological, even though the very end of it comes back to right before the Avenger starts. So you kind of have to take parts of the movies and kind of in your mind put them in a different place. So it's not 100% chronological, especially with the mid-credits and post-credit scenes as they come. Of course, those are tying to the next movie, which didn't always work for each movie. So I've seen Captain America, the First Avenger, several times. I had not watched it in a while when I watched it this last time, and it still holds up as a really good movie. Captain America is probably my favorite of the Avenger characters. And so going back to his origin story always inspires me, always encourages me. I just love that story. And especially knowing what's going to come with Endgame and the decision he makes to go back with the Infinity Stones. Spoilers, by the way, if you haven't seen any of the Avengers movies. I'm going to spoil all of them, so be warned. So at the end of Endgame, when Steve Rogers goes back to replace all the Infinity Stones, he chooses to stay in the 40s and go and live his life with Peggy Carter. Well, that is very well established in this very first movie, The First Avenger, of their relationship and how he had a date to go on a dance with Peggy Carter. And of course, he drove the plane into the ice, which froze him for 50 years or whatever. And he did not get that dance. So he always felt like he kind of missed out on that part of his life. So then jumping to Captain Marvel. And Captain Marvel it's an okay movie. I remember seeing it at the theater and it's enjoyable, but it doesn't pack the same kind of punch as most of the other movies. And a lot of things still seem kind of shoehorned in there to kind of make it fit for the 90s. I thought that was kind of interesting to have it be set in the 90s. What is kind of cool is that it sets up the space element of the Avengers movies, which we really don't get into until much later when we get to the Guardians of the Galaxy. And really because it ties in with Guardians of the Galaxy with the Kree and Ronin, I really thought that would have made more sense is to go from Captain Marvel then right into Guardians of the Galaxy, which it doesn't do. It then goes right into Iron Man. So we go from there. We go from Captain Marvel, First Avenger, then Captain Marvel, then Iron Man and Iron Man 2 are kind of back to back. Iron Man 2 doesn't really advance much of the overall story yet, but on the list, and I got a lot of flack on this and a lot of questions when I was posting this on social media about the next film is The Incredible Hulk, which I did not rewatch. I like The Incredible Hulk. I enjoyed that movie even when I saw it for the first time, and I've watched it several times since then, but it doesn't fit the overall story. And I'll give this explanation that I told a lot of people that asked me online, so letting you guys know why I chose not to watch The Incredible Hulk. Basically, Iron Man, the first one, and Incredible Hulk were kind of being made around the same time, and they actually released only a couple of months apart from each other. And so Iron Man was such a gamble for Marvel Studios. You had Jon Favreau, who was establishing himself as a director, especially for a big budget, this type of movie. Robert Downey Jr. was not the big star. He took a chance in hiring Robert Downey Jr. for the role of Tony Stark. Actually, the highest paid actor in that movie was actually Terrence Howard because he had a better track record. Even I would think Gwyneth Paltrow, would have been going to cost more because she was more established. But anyway, more backstory than you probably need. But all that to say that the stories of Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk were never in that initial phase were never supposed to be linked together. And the scene in Incredible Hulk where Tony Stark meets the general, and I can't think of his name now, played by William Hurt, that was actually filmed later. That was a scene that was actually supposed to be a post-credit scene, and they only kind of filmed it just in case the Iron Man movie did well. So then they just, once Iron Man came out and it blew up and became this big hit, then they inserted it earlier in the movie and did not. That's why that movie does not have a post-credit scene. So I say all of that to say I like The Incredible Hulk. I think it's an enjoyable movie, but it's not part of the overall story of the Infinity Saga, or it's not really an origin story really, because most of it takes place after he's had the Gamma experiment gone wrong. So, and then of course his role is recast from Edward Norton in The Incredible Hulk to then when the Hulk reappears in the first Avengers movie by Mark Ruffalo, who then plays it going forward. So another reason I didn't want to have this memory of Edward Norton's Hulk and then it'd be Mark Ruffalo for the rest of the movies. So it just, to me, made sense that I felt like it could be skipped, and I had my reasons. So those are my reasons. Whether you agree or not, those are my reasons why I chose not to watch The Incredible Hulk. So I went from Iron Man 2 right into Thor. And once again, Thor is a movie that I've enjoyed. So I like Kenneth Branagh. I like the Shakespearean kind of element that he brought to the movie. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it when I watched it for the first time. It wasn't one that I rushed out to see when it first came out in the theaters. So, but I was pleasantly surprised when I finally was able to watch it. And so even rewatching it, there are elements of it that I really enjoy. Of course, kind of rediscovering Loki for the first time and his initial tension between him and Thor was great to go back and revisit. So then you go from Thor to the very first Avengers. Now, Infinity War and Endgame being so fresh in your mind, going back and watching the first Avengers, it doesn't hold up as well as I would have liked. It seems to be very cartoonish. It's still great, it's still enjoyable, but it doesn't seem as grounded as the later Avengers movies become, and I'll talk a little bit more of that once we get to the Russo brothers. But it was still enjoyable, but it just had some spots that were just felt a little too cartoonish for me, and so for that reason, it doesn't hold up as well as I would have liked. So then we go from Avengers to Iron Man 3. Once again, I enjoyed this Iron Man movie. This one was directed by Shane Black, and I thought he did a great job. I still would like to see a Tony Stark and Rhodey buddy cop movie, because there's a lot of that banter, which Shane Black is great with because he did Lethal Weapon. So that was fun. That element of the movie was fun. Does it really advance the story, the overall story? Not as much as I would like, but it's still enjoyable. Then we get to one of the most hated, but one of the most unliked of the cinematic universe is Thor: The Dark World. This one's still tough to get through. I can't remember the director for this one, but he tried to pull a lot of the stuff that Kenneth Branagh had brought to the first Thor, but it felt like a cheap imitation. You could tell it just wasn't as thought out as well. And the whole ether and all that kind of stuff, it didn't really make sense as well as it could have. So A lot of people would like to skip that one, but of course, as we get into Endgame, it has some key elements from that movie, so it's good to go back and see. So then we get to my ultimate favorite of all of the MCU movies is Captain America: The Winter Soldier. When the Russo brothers then take over, everything to me gets elevated. The action sequences are so much better. They're faster, cleaner, just great fighting battle scenes. And I don't know another way to really put that, and of course I love a good spy thriller, and so that whole aspect of the movie really appealed to me, and it just solidified Captain America as being, my favorite of the Avengers. So then a big twist from Captain America: Winter Soldier to then James Gunn's the first Guardians of the Galaxy, which is in my top 5 of the Avengers movies because it's so much fun and it's so rewatchable. And I've seen it so many times, and even rewatching it again, it didn't disappoint. Every part that I loved, I still love. So that was great. And then in this order, you do Guardians of the Galaxy and then Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 back to back, which I thought was kind of weird, but it kind of gives you that full story of the Guardians. Once again, I don't think Guardians 2 really sets up much for the rest of the MCU movies. I think it's more of a setup for Guardians 3, which I'm looking forward to that when it finally comes around. So then we get to Avengers: Age of Ultron. Once again, the least favorite of the Avengers movies, and once again directed by Joss Whedon, who did the first Avengers movie. This one by far is the weakest. It kind of suffers from some of the same things that Thor: The Dark World does, where the dark tones of it just don't seem to work as well. Aside from kind of introducing us to Vision and to the Scarlet Witch, which I will say this, I think by the time I watched this one, I'd already started watching WandaVision. And so to be able to go back to kind of their origins was really cool to see that again and kind of see, well, I guess you see it more really in Civil War, but just kind of see how that all starts. So Age of Ultron. So then from there, we go to Ant-Man, another one of my favorites, totally rewatchable, great heist comedy. Paul Rudd is amazing, so I enjoyed watching that. Then we get to Civil War, which I have kind of some of my hangups about. I love Civil War. Once again, I think it's great. Russo brothers are back, great action sequences. But it doesn't have the same strong story as Captain America, and the whole, Winter Soldier killing Tony's parents, spoiler alert. That whole plot twist, I guess you could call that, has never really worked for me. Like, for that to be the reason that Tony just completely goes ballistic against Steve Rogers just doesn't work for me. I don't know. And I know they've never really been, close friends throughout the arc of the story, but it seemed like they had to do that for it to be called Civil War. And that part of the movie still bothers me, but I also understand that sets a lot of stuff up for Infinity War, of them being separated and come back together. So it's necessary. I just don't think it was executed as well as it could have been. Then probably my number 2 favorite of the MCU movies, Black Panther, is fantastic. It's still great. I just rewatched it right after Chadwick Boseman passed away. May he rest in peace. I think ABC ran Black Panther, I think that weekend after he passed, and did it commercial free and just played it straight through. So I watched it on TV and enjoyed it. And then just a few months later, watched it again for this and still enjoyed it. Very rewatchable. So then we go from that to Spider-Man Homecoming, which, kind of tag teams off after Civil War, because both of those characters were introduced in Civil War. So Spider-Man Homecoming in my top 5 for sure. One of the greatest Spider-Man movies, in my opinion. So I really enjoyed that, and that building that relationship with him and Tony Stark was a lot of fun to kind of see how that starts. And yeah, it's great. So then we get to Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange has never been in my top Marvel movies, and it's still a struggle for me to get through. I don't know. I'm not going to dig too much into it, but it's worth rewatching for his origin story. But I really didn't like Doctor Strange as a character until we got to Infinity War and Endgame, and then I appreciated him more. So then we go to Thor Ragnarok, which most people think is their favorite Thor movie. Thor Ragnarok is not my favorite. I still prefer the first Thor movie over Ragnarok. And I've had this discussion with a lot of people before. I felt like the humor was too forced, especially early on. It didn't sit with me the right way the first time I saw it. And so it bothered me the whole time through the movie that it was trying to make Thor like funny, and other things, I've seen Chris Hemsworth in other comedies, and I don't think comedy is his strong suit. I think he wants to be funny, but I don't think he really is that funny, or he's not as funny as, I think people want him to be, in my opinion, once again. But I will say, going back and watching it this time, I really wanted to kind of just, see it with fresh eyes. And I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it more than I had the previous 2 times that I watched it. It's still not my favorite, but I appreciate it more for what it is. Then we get into Ant-Man and the Wasp, which of course we know came out between Infinity War and Avengers, but in the timeline, from what I understand, is Ant-Man and the Wasp is happening the same time as the beginning events of Infinity War is taking place, with, Scott Lang being on house arrest and that kind of thing. So it makes sense why they would want you to watch that one first. But of course, you get to that post-credit scene and you see what happens during the snap or the blip minus the post-credit scene. Then it fits really well. Then we jump into the powerhouse. I don't like to think of Infinity War and Endgame as 2 separate movies. I've done this once before. I watched both movies back to back. A friend of mine, Chris McMitchin, who's been a co-host on my podcast, I think it was a teacher work day. He's a school teacher, and I was off. It might have been like a bank holiday or whatever. We were both off. And he was like, hey, let's come over to my house and I want to watch Infinity War and Endgame back to back. Just take a full 6 hours or whatever it was, and just watch it all as one full movie. And I enjoyed that, especially now with Snyder Cut has been released, and sitting through a 4-hour movie, that wasn't hard for me because I've typically watched Infinity War and Endgame back to back, and that's how I watched it again this time. So, and I would recommend to watch it that way. Just start Infinity War. When those credits start to roll, just go ahead and skip. But then, of course, we get to Endgame, and that kind of wraps the whole story up, which was great fun. And then what was not on this list, the next movie, is Spider-Man Far From Home, which I had not watched this one. I saw this in the theater. I saw it in the theater twice. And then when it came out on video, I bought it because I think I was able to get both the first Spider-Man and the second Spider-Man in a combo for a pretty good price. So I bought both of them, but I had not watched it from beginning to end since the theater. So this was really like watching it again after a couple of years. So it was great fun. It's a solid sequel, especially for Spider-Man, and then kind of how it's setting up for what's still to come. So that's it. That's my MCU rewatch. It was a lot of fun. If I do it again, I told Larry when he asked me about doing this episode, I was like, if I would have known I was going to be doing a podcast episode about it, I would have taken notes as I was going through, and especially because taking, I guess, 4 or 5 months to actually watch all the movies, there are some gaps in between, so trying to remember everything was a little tough. But hopefully this gave you a little bit of insight. Maybe you want to do it that way. There's a group, a Facebook group that I was asked to be a part of, and I was already way towards the end, and they decided, hey, we're going to watch, all the movies in order. And I was like, hey, I'm way ahead of you. So they're actually going and watching it. I think they're at Thor: The Dark World now, or somewhere around there, and they've been doing one every Friday night or Saturday night, and they just do everybody watches it at the same time that night, and then they get online the next week and talk about it. So it'd be fun to do with some friends, to go back and rewatch all the movies. Marvel Studios are still doing a great job. Looking forward to what they have coming up. But that's it. That's my MCU rewatch recap. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening. Thanks, Laramie, for letting me do this. I'll get to say this time, I'm Tim Williams, and I'll see you on the other side of the page when Laramie allows me to be a guest co-host again. Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Be sure to check out Tim's podcast, The 80s Flick Flashback. Tim and his guests rewatch and relive some of the great and not so great movies from the 1980s. I've had the honor to join him on a few episodes, and they are a great listen. Each episode is packed with trivia, insight, and he and his guest have a great discussion about the movie. So again, check out the 80s Flick Flashback wherever you listen to podcasts. As for this show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. That's where we will continue to grow and build as a show. Tag us and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. We are at Moving Panels. And for today, I am Laramie Wells, and even though Tim's already given the sign off, I'll say it again. I'll see you on the other side of the page.